Well, hello. Today, kids, and for your birthday, we will be reading the story Mother Teresa. And it is not what you think. So here goes Mother Teresa from ChaoS. The Crown family was on vacation when it happened. The that happened was a tragedy, of course, such as terrible things always are. When the walls of delusion crumble and the window panes that are the innocence of a child's view of the world shatter, there's loss, sadness, and pain. But hopefully, there may be recovery and even growth. The tragedy that was there, the tragedy was that there would be no recovery or growth. The Crown's lives, as they had known them, ended the moment they arrived in the remains of New York City. Billy, Sue, Darlene, the mother, Bill Sr., father, had always been a religious family. If such a quality could be measured, the Crowns qualified as devout, at least when compared to their neighbors, to the other members of their church, even to society writ large. They attended to their church every Sunday. They said grace before supper every night. Billy and Sue went to CCD every Saturday afternoon. Darlene belonged to every church group and was front and center at nearly every parish function. Right from the start, she'd been the spiritual center of the family. Bill Sr. liked to, or rather he often, or maybe, Bill Sr. was the least dedicated to their faith. For the most part, he was on board with the whole faith thing, but purely for what it brought to their lives on strictly practical and tangible levels. This meant stability of his little clan, participation in their community, and structure for the little ones. But as far as Bill Sr. was concerned, his own participation in their church was perfunctory at best. Bill Sr. had never been the kind of crow that would take anything on just pure faith, not ever. And so the spiritual end of things was something he simply didn't engage with himself. It was Bill and Darlene's drastically distinct levels of piety that came to conflict over what was typically a mundane decision that the couple made: where to take the biannual family vacation. Any debates that may have arisen on such a determination were just the two of them hashing out practical aspects for the travel options available. Things like cost, time, occupation of the children's time, etc. However, on this occasion, the most intriguing destinations appealed to radically different recreational objectives. Thus, a stage had been set for an actual debate between the two parents. 4 months before the actual trip, Bill Sr. and Darlene had taken up in their kitchen to suss out where the family would head for their trip. The two of them had been pecking through travel brochures and catalogs, eventually weeding the possible destinations down to two finalists. These were the ancient ruins of New York City and tropical Fort McMurdo in Antarctica. After only a few seconds of silent deliberation, Bill Sr. made his mind up. He decided on New York City, putting the educational value of experiencing history in person over the pure leisure and recreation of Fort McMurdo. It wasn't as if Fort McMurdo was going anywhere, and he felt as though it would put Billy and Sue a bit ahead of their peers at school in terms of real-world experiences. This was Bill's idea of being a good parent while still treating his clan to a family excursion. I say we do New York City. It'll be good for Billy and Sue. Are we sure we want to go to some place like New York City? Chirped Darlene. She was only halfway through her response before Bill Sr. was already making the arrangements on his laptop. He thought that by moving quickly, he could dissuade his wife from belaboring the decision any further. His stratagem was not effective. He could instantly tell this by his spouse's countenance. Bill Sr. was forced to pivot his approach. Why the reticence, dear? It'll be great for the kids to get a sense of historical perspective. Todd brought his family a few months ago, and they had nothing but good things to say about it. Darlene only grew more obstinate. She'd suspected that Bill had an ulterior motive to picking a trip characterized by excursions to dusty old ruins while listening to bored tour guides recite rehearsed speeches. Darlene could hear the monologues already, dreadful, boring soliloquies about things and people that may or may not have happened thousands of years ago. It didn't appeal to her at all. Most of it was made up just for the benefit of the tourists. And then it dawned on Darlene. Her husband picked New York because Todd had gone months before. Bill was jealous of him. It had become perfectly clear that the trip to New York City was just a return salvo in his never-ending game of one-upsmanship with his coworker, neighbor, and primary antagonist, Todd Anderson. Sinful. A time of sharing and joy with family polluted with envy. Darlene kept her disgust to herself. Dear, I'm just concerned that it doesn't exactly complement well with what our doctrine teaches. Exposing them to all those half-truths, it might do more harm than good, especially at their age. It's so important that they stay on the path our church and our community has laid before them. I get that, hon. I do. But it's also important for them to learn differing viewpoints, see things from another angle, ask questions. I don't want them growing up so close-minded they reject what's plain as day and sitting right in front of them. There's too many people that just believe everything they're told in this world. Darlene wouldn't let it go. You know, there's a lot of people that say those buildings are fake, that they were built to make a quick dollar off tourists. They're selling a fairy tale, dear. Bill Sr. considered this for a second, searching for a logical response. He found one. Flimsy, but still valid. I don't think it matters in the end, dear, fake or real. They need to be thinking, referring to his children. I'm all for a strong foundation in the church and in the community, but it can't be everything that they know. Faith, devotion, and community are all wonderful things, but blind faith, fanatical devotion, and community without inclusion of different opinions and theories is often detrimental. That's when a lot of people get hurt. Why can't we just go to Fort McMurdo, a stress-free, worry-free week on the beach? We could just sit in the sun and take it easy. The kids could really stretch their wings, fly around, and do what they want. We won't have to plan anything. We could just enjoy ourselves, said a frustrated and exasperated Darlene. Bill Sr. was not even slightly swayed by her appeal. Darlene saw this. She continued. So the kids are going to get all that stuff, critical thinking, dear, interrupted Bill Sr. From a bunch of fake buildings and stunted lectures from minimum wage tour guides, they're going to hate every second. Bill continued to book the trip despite Darlene's objections as if the debate had been over before it began. He didn't look up as he made his closing statement. Oh, so you've made up your mind that they're fake. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You've already made up your mind and you haven't even seen any of it for yourself. Point proved. Apparently she needed the trip as well. Maybe more so. Darlene hopped up the stairs and prayed for the strength to endure this test of her family's faith. 4 months later, the crowns were off to the ruins of ancient New York City. The events of the day that murder came to New York City and had been set in motion by something remarkable, yet entirely coincidental that it occurred while the crowns were there. There had been a discovery made at a dig site in the city by a team of archaeologists from a nearby university. Despite its significance, this serendipitous revelation would have passed the crowns by if it hadn't been for the efforts of Bill Sr. Driven by his primary motivation to stick it to Todd, the ostensible leader of the journey sought out inside info on parts of the city only open to those who made the effort. When word of the archaeological marvel spread like wildfire throughout the hotels and resorts where most of the tourists stayed, Bill caught wind and became of those who made said effort. Ever the opportunist, he was all over getting his family to the spot where it happened upon learning it. And, as a bonus, maybe this would change his wife's idea that New York City was somehow some invented attraction designed to separate gullible travelers from their hard-earned money. Probably not, as she'd been clutching her pearls in her claws since they'd arrived, so to speak. It didn't take a lot of asking around for Bill to learn that the dig site was located at a place called Times Square. Times Square was one of the more prominent attractions in the city, with exciting remnants of the lost society and culture of the species that built New York City. A species long since dead, a species Darlene was convinced had never existed. The site where the team had been working out of wasn't part of any of the package tours available to take through Times Square, but still not too far off from that place. It didn't take a lot of maneuvering for Bill to secure a guide to bring them to where the discovery had been made. And, of course, Bill felt especially proud of his negotiating skills in scoring this excursion for his clan. He'd also have a story to show up Todd Anderson. He'd have to cough up some extra money for the first-class treatment, but it was worth every penny. Fuck Todd and his smug chirping. Billy Sue and Darlene had been idling in the hotel lounge when Bill Sr. returned from his wheeling and dealing. He informed them of the change of plans for the day. Okay, guys, so different plan today. We're not going to see the forgotten torch. Billy and Sue looked up from their personal video game machines only for a moment. They didn't seem to care too much what they were going to see. It was all just more of the same boring stuff they'd been doing since they got there. Bill Jr. didn't leave his father completely hanging, however. So what's the plan now, Pop? Well, a team of archaeologists has just made the most incredible discovery at a real live dig site. Just heard about it from some locals. What is it? Asked his son. Bill considered his answer. He had no idea what the actual revelation was, only just overheard the basics being talked about in the lobby. Upon consideration, he thought it could end up being a complete letdown. Still worth the risk, though. If it sucked, he could still ham up the experience to Todd. That was important. He dismissed the notion of disappointment, though, choosing instead to hype up the trip to his family as a chance at real excitement. Well, from what I gather, it's a breakthrough that'll change our ideas of ancient history, the kind of stuff that'll be talked about by everyone for years. Billy was intrigued by this. Sue remained unfazed by her father's pitch. She remained focused on her video game. Darlene was near apoplectic. In her mind, she'd been a trooper thus far. This kind of deviation, exactly what she'd hoped to avoid, pushed her over the cliff. And how, perchance, are we going to get to this new, exciting new place, dear? It sounds like it's not on any tour that people can go on. Well, let's just say I know a guy that knows a guy. Come on, team, let's get a move on. The four of them went back up to their rooms to get ready. The kids were predictably lackadaisical and needed goading, but within a half hour they were set to embark. The crowds met up with their guide, a questionable-looking individual named Nelson. They found him perched out in front of the hotel, looking dubious simply by doing nothing. He also said nothing, only nodding to acknowledge their existence. They were off soon thereafter. It wasn't long before it became obvious to the crowds that Nelson was not an actual tour guide, least of all someone comfortable with prolonged interactions with others. Leading tourists on sojourns through the city and its various locations of interest might have been the very last thing he could have been doing, ever. Nelson didn't seem to know much about the history of the city either. He simply pulled their transport over periodically on the way and nodded to this statue, pointed to that artifact, picking the ones that seemed the most interesting. Again, saying nothing unless necessary. Darlene asked Nelson questions at the first couple of stopovers, and Nelson only replied with either, "That's a great question," "I'm not exactly sure," or "I'm sure you could get a better answer from someone at the hotel." She gave up bothering after that. After about 2 hours of pure discomfort and awkward silence, Nelson stopped their transport again and addressed the crowds. "Just as a word of caution, the people working here are very busy and probably don't want people asking a bunch of stupid questions. I know a grad student working under the guy in charge. I'll get her to come over, talk about what they've found, so just try to stay out of the rest of the team's way, and please be patient." Nelson had flipped some internal switch and became someone who knew everything about what was happening there. How did he know one of the grad students? Darlene was instinctively alarmed. Bill Sr. did not notice the change in Nelson's demeanor. Instead, he listened intently to Nelson's instructions. He then glanced back at his clan to confirm their understanding of Nelson's spiel. Billy, Sue, and Darlene each gave a little nod to their patriarch. "Okay, Nelson, sounds good," he said. Billy spoke up at that moment. "Do you know what they found, Mr. Nelson?" Nelson, facing away from Billy, didn't turn around. "They claim they've found the remains of an actual human being." This statement stunned every member of the Crown family into immediate incredulity, disbelief. I can't even say that word. Human beings were just a myth. An excerpt from a rehearsed speech given by a minimum wage tour guide delivered on a tour the Crowns took verbatim. The controversy over the veracity and authenticity of the ruins of New York City center around the fact that no remains of a living organism have ever been found anywhere in the city. Not a single bone, fossil, or trace of anything that may have inhabited these buildings traversed the streets or roads, or called the city home. Historians, archaeologists, intellectuals, and those in academia insist that some great catastrophe had somehow destroyed the denizens that once thrived in this city, so completely that forensic evidence of their existence vanished as well. What could have caused such a mass extinction? Some hypothesized that a plague had devoured every trace of their bodies, including their very bones. Others posited that a great migration had occurred, such that every individual had fled that city for fear of falling victim to the impending cataclysm. Regardless of educated guesses and erudite theories, large portions of the population continue to maintain that these ruins are a hoax based on this lack of crucial evidence. How could it possibly be that such a metropolis had ever existed with no trace of its denizens to be found? None of it made sense, and so over the years, New York became a curiosity to some, an up-jumped conspiracy theory to others, a source of both myth and proven fact. And to those like Darlene, New York City was a dangerous distraction from what was truly important for people to accept as truth. She whispered prayers to herself for the last portion of their journey to the dig site. Nelson had brought the transport to a stop about 100 yards away from a carefully cordoned off area at the dead end of a darkened side street. Roughly 20 or so individuals were busy with their work within the area. A couple were pecking down notes and journals, others were digging and excavating spots in the ground within the area, and a couple more were ensconced in deep conversation. The group disembarked. Nelson wasted no time in making his way over to the site. He flagged one of the crew down, presumably his in, at the site. She hopped over to him, and after an animated conversation, the two of them returned to where the Crown family waited. Bill Sr. deduced the connection quickly. The grad student had gone local with Nelson in her spare time. Nelson remained silent while his contact addressed the family. Well, I have to say we weren't expecting visitors or tourists so soon, but I suppose word travels fast in this dump. She glared at Nelson, who didn't look up to notice her. I'll have to let Dr. Fergus know that we'll have to make an official statement sooner than planned about this to the public. But I guess it's good to know our secret is out this way before we're ambushed by the media or the news. The Crowns all glanced at each other nervously, having been made keenly aware that their presence wasn't exactly welcome. Nelson had warned them, however. So, introductions. I'm Julie Clausen, and I'm a grad student of Dr. Fergus. He's in charge of the expedition. We've been at this spot for 2 months, and a couple of days ago we found actual remains. Billy, Jr., was now fully enthralled. Of something that lived here? That's right. Darlene spoke next. That's impossible. This whole thing is fake, interjected Julie. Far from it, ma'am. Darlene scoffed. This is as real as it gets. I don't believe it, Darlene retorted. Julie Clausen seemed incensed at her disbelief and took Darlene's response as a personal insult. Hold that thought just a moment, ma'am. Julie returned to her colleagues and spoke with one of them intently for a few minutes. There seemed to be an agreement between her and whomever she spoke to, who came back. Okay, people, come with me. And please be careful not to touch or disturb anything or anyone. We really shouldn't be doing this, but I gotta be honest. I'm sick to death of people denying facts. It's like truth gets murdered every single day by people like you, Julie said, clearly speaking at Darlene. Julie motioned with her wing for the Crowns to follow her. Julie fell in next to Darlene. I bet you're the religious type, Mrs. Crown. Darlene glared at her. I believe in something greater than ridiculous fairy tales and dreamed up nonsense. You're a fucking idiot then. The only fairy tales are the ones you listen to from some book written about an all-powerful imaginary friend. Julie hopped away from her, having artfully delivered her dig. Darlene shouted after her. I'll pray for you, Julie. Fuck you, lady, retorted Julie. Bill Sr. heard this last and spun around to glare at his wife. The group hopped over to the sectioned off area, and each flapped their feathers lightly to get over the rope that had been set up. Sue had become visibly nervous, and Darlene took notice of this. Sue's mother rubbed her head against her daughter's, even going so far as to giving her a light, reassuring peck on her back with her beak. Reassuring her child had a similar effect on Darlene. Julie motioned over to a rectangular section of earth that had been dug out. The Crowns drew to the edge and peered down inside the hole. There, at the bottom of the dugout area, was not just a bone or two, or a simple skull or impression that a human had once been there, but the actual corpse of an organism that had been simply a rumor, a myth. Humans were a legend only mentioned, spoken about, or written into bedtime stories, campfire tales, or fanciful works of fiction. But here it was. It was an actual human being. From the looks of it, the human was a child wearing what had been called clothing in all of those exaggerated tales. The child was clutching what looked like a small bear made from the same material as the clothes. The human being somehow still looked partially alive, The eyes were open, and the face was frozen in an expression of surprise. Its skin was smooth, with not a single feather to be found anywhere. The skin was an alien color, the same hue of a saturated thundercloud, ready to burst at any moment. It was a silk gray, grotesque and infinite within its preserved state of lifelessness. The Crowns could not believe what they were seeing. "I guess you'd call that kind of a miracle, everyone," quipped Julie Closen. Bill Sr. was astounded. An actual human being. Or at least what once was a human being. "How is this?" Julie answered. "We believe that this specimen was terminated somehow before what we refer to as the Great Cataclysm." "You mean," implied Billy, "she was murdered. If you look at the side of its head, you can see that it had been struck with a blunt object." Silence followed. "There's a special kind of wind that blows in cities, and only cities, that's abnormal, a perversion of nature. You feel it on your body, your hair blows this way and that, and the air around you grows colder. But it doesn't make the same sound. In the forests, you can hear it in the trees and through their leaves. Amid the concrete right angles and wide spaces of the city, it is next to silent. It evoked a feeling that ghosts walked freely in the streets. That exact kind of haunted wind picked up at that moment. It raised the feathers on every member of the Crown family as they stood near the remains of one of those possible specters. Silence for another 30 seconds. And then Darlene. "This is a fake." There were 2 days left in the Crown's trip to the ruins of New York. On the first of these, news of the morbid discovery had broken in late morning, taking over every media outlet thereafter. From television to radio, social media to independent pundits with unasked for opinions, there was no escaping the tsunami that had been unleashed upon the world. For the Crowns, that first day was absent of itinerary. Each member of the family was left to do their own thing. Bill Sr. spent his time bragging to complete strangers of he and his family's first-hand experience the previous day. At one point, a murder of various individuals gathered round to hear his magnificent tale. Sue was glued to her Beak Page account, messaging her friends and playing the whole thing down like it wasn't that big of a deal. This was her way to maximize her coolness quotient, having seen, quote, "the craziest thing ever," unquote. Billy Jr. just sat in his nest and read anything and everything he could find online on New York City, the myths and legends of human beings, and any subject even tangentially related to what they had encountered the day before. Dr. Fergus, first name Evan, transformed into a hero as Billy learned about his life. Darlene spent her time in the sky, flying from perch to perch. Any other crow that attempted to join her to talk about the human girl, or even just to make small talk, was either screeched at outright or outright attacked. By Darlene. Each successive encounter made her grow simultaneously more and more disgusted with what had occurred, with both the state of the world, her family, and what she regarded as the imminent fall of corvidity from God's grace. She resolved within herself that by remaining steadfast while in the epicenter of deception and evil, she would become a kind of prophet of propriety and faith. She must prepare herself to save this polluted world. She returned to the family just before bedtime and said nothing. She did not sleep, consumed with pure revulsion for her husband, disappointment with her children. On the last day, which really wasn't a day and more of getting organized, finishing packing, and confirming their travel itinerary, Darlene announced to her family, "I have something to do." Darlene did not come back to their room. She vanished for 3 years, leaving no trace, making no communications with her once beloved murder in that entire time. On the third anniversary to the day of their excursion to the dig site, Darlene returned. It was a Sunday. Mass had convened at the church the Crowns were members. Attendance had dropped to a mere fraction since the human girl, now named Doris, had been unearthed. The Reverend entered the temple through his entrance to prepare, but soon had to lock every entrance, shutter every window, and bar the main doors. Terrified to the point of temporary insanity by what he found, the Reverend perished at the foot of his altar when his heart had decided that it would bear no more. The Reverend had found 26 of the perches where worshippers would take up had been occupied. The mangled corpses of every single member of the archaeological team from 3 years previous had each been nailed to their own individual perch. The decapitated head of Julie Clausen had been mounted upon the bookstand where their holy book had always been left. The book had been opened to a selected passage undecipherable by just a glance. Her beak had been torn off. The top half had been driven into her left eye, the bottom into her right. Written in what was certainly her blood was a single word: blasphemer. The Crowns were all at home, engaged in their own preoccupations. Bill Sr., Sue, Billy, and Delilah — Bill Sr. had moved on from Darlene 2 years previous — all heard the screeching at the same time and convened within seconds to the living room. Each of them peered out a window. They saw that their house had been surrounded by a sea of black. The screeching, squawking masses grew louder and larger as each moment passed. And then, all at once, the mob fell silent. The Crowns huddled together, gathered at one window that faced the front of their home. The masses parted, and as soon as a suitable area was produced, Darlene came forth. Her wings were gone. The feathers on her breast and atop her brow had their color dyed to appear the same pallid gray as the flesh of Doris, the human child. She said, "Behold, all ye who come to my place of shame, my place of failure. Tremble not, fear not, for I come here to sanctify what was lost, to offer unto our Lord the purest of all sacrifices, the one that symbolizes the highest love we can achieve at the hour of our perdition, the ones that we still love, despite their heresy, and in doing so I shall be reborn unto thee." The squawking began again. The house where the Crowns huddled was set aflame, and the squawking did not cease until there was nothing left of their home and the Crowns but smoldering ash. That's when a lot of people can get hurt. In the moments of silence before the devout flew into the sky, one of their number crowed into the night. The prophet and Savior, Mother Teresa, has come onto us. Happy birthday, kiddo.